Okay, so in this video, which you're still watching, oh my goodness, in this video I want to talk a little bit about what implications all of this work we've done might have for thinking about your own role in society as a moral individual. How you can use your own resources and your own power to make the world a better place, while also, of course, taking care of yourself. So, again, our approach to this question is going to have a lot to do with our overall take on the welfare theorems. If your overall takeaway from all this is that markets are pretty efficient, right? And markets are generally going to do the right thing to allocate resources, then being a good person might be very simple. Essentially what you'd say is, well, I can go about living my life the way that I want, right? Make decisions that are good for me, as long as I don't produce, be a little bit mindful of producing externalities, right? Don't go out of my way to be a pest to other people. Don't lie to people, right? Don't take advantage of information asymmetries. Don't exploit people when I have a particular ability to do that, right? To set prices. But beyond that, being a good person just means doing what I want for myself, and then taking some of my own resources, my own wealth, my own income, and giving it to the people who are most needy in the world, right? Essentially, committing yourself to a lump sum tax. So I think the people in the world who probably have this perspective in the most, in the clearest way, are what are often called effective altruists, right? Where what effective altruism says is the way that you should, at least one big piece of being a good person, is saying, let's look at causes like malaria prevention, where you have immense benefits, right, for a marginal dollar donated, and say, live your life, do the job that you find interesting, right? Go ahead and drink a fancy cappuccino when you feel like it, but pick some percentage of your income, something like 10%, and donate it every single month to the charitable cause that's doing the most good in the world. And what that cause is likely to look like is something like either just giving resources to the poorest people in the world, or giving the poorest people in the world some particular well-chosen public good, right? Something like malaria bed nets. And so in this perspective, right, being a good person isn't complicated, isn't difficult, it's just, or I should say, isn't complicated, it's just hard, right? You get to be selfish when you're selfish, but then being a good person is about how much of the time you're willing to be generous. And when you're generous, all you have to do to be generous is tax yourself and transfer to someone else. Right, so if markets work, markets are efficient, basically be selfish, except for when you're generous. On the other hand, if you look at the world, you look at these assumptions we've had to make, and you see a world full of market failures, right? A world where pollution is creating enormous problems, right? Where there's enormous public goods, right? Opportunities for positive externalities that are going unfulfilled. Then morality is going to be a little bit more complicated, right? Being a good and useful and helpful person in the world is going to take a little more. It might look at its most, at its best informed by the market, by the welfare theorems. What this might look like is just taking real efforts to avoid producing your own market failures. So, in circumstances, when you have an ability to set prices, what you might want to do, if you don't believe that markets are efficient, if you believe that market power is a problem, don't set prices in your own interests, right? Be willing to take a loss in order to produce the efficient allocation. Now this might seem very, very abstracted, right? But, let's imagine that you find yourself in a position where say your neighbor is looking to move in a hurry and needs to get rid of all of their furniture, right? Doesn't have time to look for good buyers. Maybe if you're worried about not contributing to market failures, you would be willing to pay them something like market price, even though you could get away with paying them a lot less. right? You'd worry about internalizing externalities. So you'd think about things like when you're deciding what food to buy, you would think about what kinds of foods contribute the most to climate change, or what kinds of foods were produced in ways that had the most exploitative labor conditions. You might also do things, right? If your favorite pizzeria is throwing their grease in the back, every time that they make a pizza, you might tax yourself, right? When you decide to go eat there, you might say, every time I eat at that place, I have to donate $1 to a charity of my choice, right? In order to feel in your heart the cost to society of your actions. And you should take every opportunity not to take advantage of private information, right? Be honest, be honorable, don't lie to people. If you're selling a car, right, and you know the car is a junker, tell people it's a junker. The problem is, so that all seems very straightforward, right? The problem is, in a lot of circumstances, market forces, especially the zero profit condition, can make doing this stuff difficult. Harder even than it would be in the absence of markets. So, as an example, for most hog farmers in the United States, hog farmers in the United States tend to castrate male hogs. This is going to get kind of graphic and horrible, so just a warning, right? The reason they castrate the hogs is because American consumers of pork products don't like the really, really hoggy taste you get from uncastrated males. Now, it's possible to give the baby pigs anesthetic so that this castration doesn't hurt very much. But doing so would be a little bit more expensive. It would take a little bit more time and it would take extra resources versus castrating without anesthetic. And so in the United States, virtually all hog producers, almost all pork producers, don't use any anesthetic when they castrate their male hogs. So let's imagine that you're a hog producer and you're trying to make this decision, right? We could say cost maybe 10 cents a pound for your pork if you were to castrate all of your piglets. So if there was no competitive market, if you're the only hog producer in your farm, in your town, right, you have demand for pork, it's downward sloping, right? I'm deciding am I going to sell pork for, I don't actually know how much pork costs, $3 a pound, or for $3.10 a pound. You'd lose very little money, right, by deciding that you're going to raise your prices by 10 cents. Many people would probably be willing to pay this. But in a competitive market, any particular pork producer isn't going to face a downward sloping demand curve for pork. They're going to face a horizontal demand curve for pork. Right? And they're going to have a price, a horizontal demand curve for pork, at a price where they're just barely breaking even. Right? So if you decide that you're going to raise your cost by 10 cents, you're going to make an economic loss. Right? There's no way to avoid it. You're not going to get the price up. And unless you're able to convince people, unless you put a cruelty-free sticker on your pork products, no one's going to be willing to pay more, right? Because they won't know that you treated your pigs any differently. And so in a competitive market, right, your choices are either to make a loss relative to everyone else in the economy, right, potentially go bankrupt, or do what everyone else is doing. So you might find yourself in a situation where most of the individual pork producers would actually be willing to make a little bit less money in order to treat their pigs a little bit better. But none of them individually have the power to do so, right? None of them have any market power. None of them have an ability to deviate from the lowest cost way of producing. So that brings us to what I see as kind of a nuanced take on this question of how to be a good person in a market economy, which is that if you're thinking about where to focus your efforts, right, what problems to try to solve, part of the question becomes, what are the aspects of your life in which you have power, where you personally matter? When you're supplying something where the supply is perfectly elastic, right, which as a human being, right, if you're supplying labor in a market where there's lots and lots of people who can replace you, your ability to take a moral stand on the way that a company is doing business is almost non-existent. But if you have rare and special skills, if you're incredibly useful to someone, then you might have the power all by yourself to make changes, right? When you're a consumer and you've got a demand for a product that's relatively inelastic, such as, for example, if you're a consumer for college education, you have relatively more power to shape the way that institutions operate, right? If you're, if you think about, to make this concrete, there's been a lot of discussion lately about social media companies having business practices that people feel uncomfortable with, right? Designing their products to be more addictive than is in individuals' best interests. Potentially designing their products in a way that lead to greater political polarization. And one of the real responses that's come out of that is that highly placed workers in Silicon Valley have protested their own companies, right? Have insisted that their companies change their practices. That's entirely in keeping with an understanding of market forces, right? If I'm Facebook and I'm deciding, do I make my product a little more or less addictive, I might not actually have that much power, even as a giant company, because of the fact that I have competitors for people's time and attention. But if enough of my workers insist that I change my practices, then they're going to shift the lowest cost way for me to produce output. Right now, if I end up engaging in practices my employees don't like, I'm going to have to pay more for labor. So this brings me to maybe the last thing, right? So the first thing is to think about kind of your own contributions to market failures, to be generous, right? To transfer income when you have extra money. But then the last thing is to team up, to magnify your power, right? As we just saw with the pork producer example. In many cases, individuals don't have a lot of power, but enough individuals together, a concerted group of people, do have an ability to shape things more effectively. Okay, that's enough for today. Thank you so much for, if anyone's still here, thank you so much for continuing to listen to me pontificate through all this time. I hope you found this interesting, and I look forward to talking to you about it soon.